Hello and welcome to our program. In today's episode of Voices, we have an extraordinary progressive voice of India, a voice that is fearless, a voice that speaks up for those that do not have a voice. Also, a successful businesswoman, a publisher, an actress, and an accomplished classical dancer who has performed the world over using her dance and her art for social transformation. Welcome to our program, Mallika. Sadly, Mallika, we are meeting at a time when the progressive voices of India are in a state of mourning. Because just a few hours ago, as you know, Father Stan Swamy died under some tragic circumstances in a hospital. He was 84 years old and he had been in prison for more than 8 months under anti-terror laws. Father Stan Swamy was in a very fragile state of health. He was suffering from Parkinson's disease, heart disease, and various comorbidities associated with old age. Several appeals for his bail were released. I mean, at his age and with his health, he was hardly a flight risk, but he was kept in prison and he was, in the end, denied dignity even in his last days. Mallika, what does Father Stan Swamy's situation and the circumstances of his death say about India as a country, the government, the institutions of India, and most importantly, India's people?
Deepak, I, for one, usually a proud Indian, hang my head in shame at what is happening. Stan is just a representation of the widespread repression that is going on in this country, the widespread dampening of voices, be they in journalism, be they in the courts, be they in public life. The use of anti-terror and sedition laws on anybody and everybody that is inconvenient, from 20-year-olds to 84-year-olds. The despicable conditions of our jails in any case, where often people who have not been charged with anything languish for 25 years before they are set free. What life do they have? At least with the kind of people who have been thrown into jail recently, there is a public awakening, though there is still a deafening silence, at least there is a public awakening of the kind of terror that is unleashed in the name of law. But think of all the hundreds of thousands of young Muslims, young Dalits, young Adivasis who have no one to fight for them, who probably don't even know why they are in, except that they happen to be at the wrong place, the wrong time, when a policeman decided that he had to fill up some numbers on how many Maoists he had arrested, or something as absurd as that. Every day in the newspapers there are stories of somebody being let off 11 years, 20 years, 19 years after they have been thrown into jail, when their case hasn't even come up. And finally, there are some judges who are speaking. Finally, the new Supreme Court Chief Justice is speaking up, and other judges in high courts, after a long period of complete, are beginning to speak up and say, no, this law is being misused, these people are not threats. But unfortunately for Stan Swamy, it was too little too late, and Mihir really fought, and there was so much support and so many petitions that we have signed. It was just grotesque what was done to him.
Of course, at a time of a pandemic, when governments the world over are actually being lenient on political prisoners and trying to keep their jails empty, it's quite extraordinary that people are being put behind bars. Do you think India's people could have done more for Father Stan and can do more? I mean, what is it that prevented people from gathering in a few thousands or even in lakhs in front of prisons with people like Father Stan?
I have often asked this, that why is it that it took so many years before, in the case of Nirbhaya, people actually took to the streets? And why is it that in spite of 30, 40,000 farmers being at the doorsteps of Delhi for over 5 months, there is no general swell of public support? Why aren't there people gathering in state capitals every day? There are 2 or 3 different reasons, I think. One is that for the poor, for the rural, life is so goddamn difficult that just getting the next meal on the table, just seeing that their daughter is not raped, just seeing that somebody from the family is not picked up for some completely falsified reason, becomes so important that they do not have the luxury to think of the larger picture. That's one. The second is that the middle class is the middle class. They only think of themselves. Very, very few from the rich middle class, from the people who should be the intellectuals, are in fact even conscious of a conscience. And for them, unless a family member dies of COVID, it is still the university of WhatsApp that feeds them. And even so, their level of being incensed is probably something that lasts for 3 minutes. I think there is such a sense of complacency that people just don't gather, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying. I mean, even pre-COVID, in the last 20 years, I must have taken part in 100 processions, and the paucity of people at these, especially in the city of Ahmedabad, it's disgusting. I mean, this is the city which was known for its protests. And yet, except I think the last large protest was in 1974 when we joined the student movement to bring down Chiman Bhai's ministry, and then that stone rolled into the emergency. I think people are just too comfortable in their skins.
But we saw an exception in late 2019 and early 2020 when people came out on the streets against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And it was not just the Muslims who were, largely affected by those new citizenship laws.
That was the one ray of hope for all of us who feel so dejected. That was a huge ray of hope. But the government knew how to shut that down.
But same thing hasn't happened, sadly, because of COVID. That came to a halt, and we have not seen people show the same keenness to step out of their homes and take to the street.
How many people actually did something about the migration crisis that went on immediately after the lockdown? Yes. Lots of people gave money to try and feed them. There was more, but I'm talking of the general public. I'm not talking of civil society organizations. I'm not talking of the 10,000 people who are always there to help. I'm not talking of them. I'm talking of your normal educated business person. I'm talking of your normal educated college student.
That is true. And of course, as you said, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of civil society activists, journalists, students, academics who are behind bars for speaking up against the government, some of them for just making a social media post. In your own state, there is the case of Sanjeev Bhatt, the whistleblower policeman who can't even get a bail hearing, let alone being tried or being charged properly. What can actually be done? Is there something that can be done to force the government to make a change or change its attitude towards its own people?
This is a government that the more pressure that is brought, the more adamant they become. I have known this of the Prime Minister when he was Chief Minister here. It becomes a battle of perception and of ego. And I have been following Sanjeev Bhatt's case. Sanjeev Bhatt was the one who told the Nanavati Commission about the way I was framed post my filing a petition in 2002 against the government and against the police department and against the administration, how I had been framed. Sanjeev was the one. Sanjeev's wife is actually a graduate from our institution. She's a dance graduate. Sanjeev's father-in-law was one of our very famous writers. So I've known the family. I have been in processions to try and get his release. But unless democracy works on a day-to-day basis and we hold our elected people accountable, which has never happened in India. We think democracy is democracy because we vote every 5 years, and that in itself is such a big deal, especially with the educated urban voter. But that's not what democracy is about, and democracy changes things in one way, which is by changing governments.
Yes.
By ruling people out. There is no other way in a democracy. Because if everybody is nominated, from the vice chancellor to the presidents to the governors, everybody, to every single judge, is nominated by the dominant party, then what recourse do you have institutionally? None.
Yes. Talking about perceptions, before the Modi government was elected, we often heard about the famous Gujarat model. Now you were born in Gujarat, you have grown up in Gujarat. What is your take on the so-called Gujarat model? Could you tell us what you think about it?
Did you ever know of a very famous magician called K. Lal? Yeah, so K. Lal would do this and he would say, waters of India. And the entire audience would see this water pouring down and be convinced absolutely. And he would do it with such a flourish and with so many light bulbs going off and with such a smile and so on, that everybody would be convinced even though they knew that their hands were not wet. You might perhaps know that I stood for the Lok Sabha election in 2009. I stood against Mr. L.K. Advani, who had been elected from the Gandhinagar constituency, which is Gandhinagar Ahmedabad. I actually live in the constituency for the last 20 years, and who had actually never visited the constituency. And during my 1 month of trying to get to know my constituency, and it's a very large constituency with 210 villages, I would go from village to village, where they would say, we have no water, in the monsoon the water floods here, our children can't go to school, we have no electricity, etc., 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 whole list of what is not there. And each of the villages was convinced that it was only their village, everybody else was flourishing. And it is this amazing management of the non-existent, the amazing management of a hologram, and making us all feel that the hologram is it, that the Gujarat model is like. You look at the Gujarat Health Ministry website, and it has page after page of primary health center here, primary health center here, and then as you roll down, you see vacancy, 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 vacancy. In I think it was 2008 or 9, there was a water scheme called Sujalam Sufalam that was launched in Gujarat to build over 1 lakh check dams overnight so that there would be no drought. And a colleague of mine, we run in Darpana something called Kranti, which is the Citizens Research and Activism Bureau, to try and get citizens to actually activate themselves to becoming better citizens. We went out and we took photographs of these so-called dams, and in most places there were 2 gunny bags filled with sand in the middle of nowhere that had been paid for as a check dam. The newspapers were announcing all check dams made and so on and so forth, and we did an RTI and came up with a thousands of crore scam that has still not been explained, and the CGI looks at it every year, but it's still not been explained. This is the Gujarat model. Whether you look at education, you look at health, you look at agricultural development, it is a non-model. For God's sakes, don't corporatize the world.
Mhm. So how do you explain the continued success of the ruling party in Gujarat, after so many elections? And
Nobody as blind as those who refuse to see. You know, Gujarat has always had a tag of being Napunsak. You know, there are no Gujaratis in the army, there are very few Gujaratis who are tough guys, and so on. And this has been a perception that especially the Gujarati male has had to live with. And so when a 56-inch Chester comes and says, I am the He-Man and I am going to save you, the puny little boys who have never been to a gym and who think that's wrong suddenly perk up. And they perk up because there is a Gujarati who is ruling the land at long last. And this time it's not somebody as effeminate as Gandhiji, but this is our He-Man, this is our super Marvel hero. And that is a huge perception.
and you spoke about people voting or voting a government out. Now there is another perception that there is no alternative. If not Modi,
Listen,
who?
as far as I am concerned, I don't care who. You can put this thermos flask there and it will do less harm than this government is doing. I don't care who it is. The most bumbling, corrupt person will not be as divisive and as strategically divisive so as to put us back 200 years, 250 years. This is an exceptionally intelligent and well organized government set to divide and rule this country. The poor British didn't have an inch on them in their divide and rule policy. So it's not a question of who, it can be nobody. It can be just an empty chair and the country will run better. We will not be pouring hatred into the veins of every Indian every single day.
I mean, it's obvious that you are an outspoken voice. You're fearless. You not only do you speak, you take action. I remember you filed a public interest litigation soon after the 2002 riots, and you run an academy, Darpana, in Ahmedabad, and you have so many projects going on. How do you manage to continue all this work and yet be so outspoken in a situation, in an environment like this? Do you face any challenges?
Oh, every day, every single day. Um, while Mr. Modi was Chief Minister of Gujarat, no Gujarat company would be seen talking to me. But there were large companies outside who would invite me to perform. I would go to conferences. Since 2014, anybody who is seeing, even speaking to us, becomes a pariah. And you know how quickly the structures of this country start raiding the offices, start harassing. I mean, we have seen it happen day after day to anybody who speaks. I mean, suddenly there are 25 raids in all their offices. Now, the raids might be justified at other times, but the swiftness, I mean, we saw it in West Bengal. Why is it that the people who had stayed on with Trinamool, who were in the Sharda scam, were suddenly raided? And why is it that the two people who had gone over, who were actually even more important in the scam, were protected? I mean, it doesn't even require an intelligence of 50, an IQ of 50 to see what is happening. It is terrifying. But there are times when one cannot remain silent, and these are those times. I'm not sure what speaking up is going to do, but I cannot not speak up. It would be wrong. And I think my colleagues at Darpana and the few people who still believe in me and continue to want my work and continue to want me to speak up, I think know the repercussions, and I know the repercussions.
You're very brave to stay upright in these extraordinarily challenging circumstances. Let's talk about a bit of your art. You have used the power of art for social messaging and social transformation. So, I won't go into the past. You've worked with Peter Brook's Mahabharat, and there have been other projects that are so well known, playing the role of Draupadi, and also about victims of violence. Unsuni, your project was about children from not so privileged.
Unsuni was based on a book by my friend and colleague Harsh Mandar. For those of your viewers who don't know Harsh was an IAS officer for 20 years who resigned after the 2002 Gujarat pogrom and has been a civil society activist ever since. He also has cases filed against him just now. He gave a very beautiful and moving speech after the death, and he has been also charged under some anti-terror laws for inciting violence when all Harsh is capable of speaking is love. But he had written a book called Forgotten Voices about some of the people that he had met over his 20-year career as an IAS officer who was standing up for an entire class of people, be they Muslims or be they tribals whose land had been taken away, or be they a woman manual scavenger who later represented that casteism in the United Nations and so on. And I thought, speaking to my children were 15 and 16 and 10 at that time, and speaking to their friends, all of whom came from educated families, professional families, and I realized that they were clueless about India. To them, choosing an ice cream from Ben and Jerry or Naturals was the sort of life choice. And I thought, if these are considered our leaders for tomorrow, they need to realize what India is. So I created a performance specifically targeting elite schools and colleges to take these questions to them and to start a discussion, and if possible to start a voluntary movement where these children got to know more about these issues and volunteered to help the less privileged. And it was a huge success. Axis Bank gave us the money to travel. We traveled and performed pro bono for 120 institutions. And by the end of it, we had 7,000 young people volunteering for change. And it could be something very simple. It could be going into the slum behind their school and teaching the children football. Or it could be going to the elderly and reading to them. Or it could be teaching science to their maids' children. It didn't have to be like jhanda waving or anything like that. As long as we were making them aware that this was India, this is what 85% of the people face on a daily basis, and that is what you need to change, and that is where your entrepreneurial abilities and your leadership qualities need to show up. Then we were succeeding in that. And I have to say that there are still schools that we visited which run parallel Unsuni schools for the underprivileged, giving them exactly the same kind of facilities as their paying students get. So it was a very rewarding 1 year.
And what sort of impact do you think it made? Did you get any feedback? And have you seen, of course, Unsuni.
I used to get feedback for several years after that, and I'm sure that it has made an impact. I do visit some of those schools again, and the school teachers always tell me about the impact that it had on the children, and they continue talking about issues like that to their newer children. So I'm sure that it has made a huge impact.
Okay, and another role, your role of Draupadi, it had impact not only among Indian women or women among the Indian diaspora that Mahabharata was performed around the world, but also among women around the world, especially of the indigenous communities. For those who may not be familiar with this, could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yes, I actually spent some wonderful months in Australia during that period at the Perth and the Adelaide Festival, where we carved out stone mines to perform in them. And that was very, very interesting. Yes, the impression of Indian mythology that has gone out is always the long-suffering wife willing to jump into the fire if her husband asks, because she's pativrata. Mm-hmm. And Draupadi does not fit this mold. And I had the most diverse women, from Sorbonne graduates in Paris to Black American mamas in Harlem, and to your indigenous communities in Perth and Adelaide, coming and saying, now that's a woman we relate to. We didn't realize a woman like that could come out of India. That's a woman we would like to be like. Mm-hmm. which was extraordinary for me because I have always tried to, in my work, to take away the patriarchal trappings of the way our women are presented, both historical and mythological, and to re-look at them from their own point of view, from a woman's point of view. And I have worked with everybody from Sita to Sati Savitri to Ahalya and of course to Draupadi. And it was an amazing experience that women across the world related to this woman who basically said, I have a brain and I have a womb and I'm happy with both and I will use both. That having a womb is not, it does not mean weakness, and having a brain does not mean a lack of femininity. You know, the feminist movement outside India in Abrahamic religious countries has been very much, I hate men, therefore I'm a feminist. That's the mold that it's been framed in, primarily by men. But the feminist movement actually in India is a very feminine movement as well, because for us, the highest power is Shakti, who is a woman. She is the one who can destroy everybody when nobody else can, not even Shiva. So for us, the concept of Ardhanarishwara, which if you look at DNA, is correct, that each of us has both male and female genes. And that is the concept of Ardhanarishwara. Hinduism, which is still 80% of our culture, did not come out of a white bearded man. It came out of this being that was half feminine and half masculine, where the kinetic energy was feminine and not masculine. Without that kinetic energy, the masculine is dead. So we come from a very different perspective. And I used to have wonderful arguments with Peter Brook about this, when he would say, don't raise your voice, you sound like a shrew. And I would say, Peter, you don't know India, we are only Shaktis, there are no shrews.
And tell us, with Peter Brook, you also redefined or rewrote the role of Draupadi for his Mahabharata, didn't you? I mean, I think.
Well, I argued vociferously, like the argumentative Indian I am. And as I was the only Indian voice, I was also the only one who had read many, many, many different versions of the Mahabharata. And remember that this was in the 80s, this was before the time of the internet, this was before the time of Xeroxing, facsimile was just happening. So I would be sitting in Paris, and after 3 days I would get a trunk call through to my mother, and I said, do you remember such and such a version of the Mahabharata? Please post it to me so that I can show this proof to Peter Brook and the writer Jean-Claude Carrière, and they will believe me that a version like this exists.
Yes.
So yes, it was a battleground of its own.
Yes.
I have to say that as a director and as one of the world's most famous directors, Peter was grudging with me, but he accepted most of my suggestions.
Yeah, that is quite extraordinary. And women with broken wings, that's another very issue related to women. It's about victims of violence. I would like to hear more about your current projects, but could you briefly tell us a bit about that too?
Well, I got to know at a conference this extraordinary pianist called Elisabeth Sombart. And I first saw her perform and realized that she was using yogic breathing techniques to play the piano. So I went up to her at the end of the concert and started talking, and over the next 2 or 3 days we continued talking and realized that both of us wanted and believed that the arts could be used to draw attention to, but also to heal violence. And from that came this project called Women with Broken Wings. The idea was that every woman who is abused feels that she is alone, that hers is a unique situation, and that it must be her fault. And the idea was to create on the internet a world where anybody who had lost a woman to violence, or any woman who had been violated, could put a star and her story, and that would connect with a star somewhere else in the world, to make a family of women who could share their woes and share their trauma and not feel alone.
That's beautiful. And Also, Colors of Our Heart. I believe you drew inspiration from the music of Gully Boy.
Gully Boy wasn't if Gully Boy wasn't done then.
Okay, so
we
yeah.
were doing it parallelly.
Okay.
Actually, I would love to show you an excerpt of that. But I have always been very fascinated with rhythm and spoken word. Uh, my mother in 1963 was learning Gujarati as somebody who had come from the south, and her teacher was teaching her through the newspapers, and she came upon case after case of what later became called dowry deaths. And she was so horrified that she created a piece called Memory is a Fragment of Eternity, about a young girl who goes into her wedded home with high hopes and thinking that she'll be loved, and then the pressures of dowry that finally leads her to taking her baby and jumping into the well. And Amma wanted to universalize it, so she wanted a language that was not a language, because very often somebody will go and say, oh, I don't know opera, I don't know Italian, that's why I don't go to the opera. Or I don't understand Tamil, that's why I can't understand Bharatanatyam. So she took the mnemonics of Mridangam, which is tadinginnatom, takita, tadinginnatom, and so on, which are meaningless. They are just mnemonics. They are reflections of a sound of a drum. And she imbued them with emotion. So the audience was hearing the emotion and not getting a wall of language put up. So I have always been fascinated by that. And then I came across the work of, poor chaps are now called the Gully Boys, but it's called something else, and went to them because there were two books that had inspired some of the sequencing of Colors of Her Heart. And one of them was a book called Chup. And in Chup, it says all the things that a good girl has to be and a bad girl cannot be. And another was about how girls are always expected to adjust. Thoda sa adjust kar lo. It's always the girl who has to adjust. And I thought these would make amazing rap sequences. So I went to the people who were doing this kind of rap. As it happened, Gully Boy was happening parallelly. And they created these numbers for me, which I found extremely excited, and which used to bring the house down on our only tour in America, where we performed it in 10 different cities.
Okay. So, Mallika, what else can we expect in the coming months or years from you?
Well, I have to tell you about a very exciting project that we are doing just now. In 2019, we started a project called Nritya Parichay, which was to take folk and tribal dancing to municipal schools, to children who are really deprived, who are deprived of good education, whose parents were probably laborers and they got nothing from there, whose teachers were probably bored with them. And because I have always felt, and science proves this, that to get the body moving and music coming in sets off all the right chemical reactions that takes away mental stress and gives us a feeling of goodness, a feeling of well-being. It also gives confidence, it gives a certain presence. And you know, in India, we shame people about their bodies. Girls are always told, aise karo, don't show your breast, don't take your chest back. So the body becomes, by the time a child is 12 or 13, the seat of shame. Now, I know that it cannot be, because the body is the only body we have, and the body is our strength, it's our temple. So we started this project in 10 schools in Ahmedabad, and it was a huge success. Within 3 months, absenteeism dropped, the children were so much more confident, they would look you in the eye and so on. Then COVID happened. And these are the children who would not have a phone. We couldn't trace them. If there was a phone, there was one phone, and it wasn't a smartphone. And we've been struggling to say that with all the mental depression that has come with COVID, we need to do this even more. So finally, we've launched it, and we have done an online series, and we are now working with adolescents on the Barmer, Pakistan border. We are working in a Muslim school in Lucknow. We are working with tribal children in Gujarat, in Mundra. And it has been fascinating. It's been on for 2 months. We are creating offline and online material. We are taking Zoom classes. We are training trainers so that they can become teachers. And it's just giving us so much satisfaction and joy to be able to see the transformation within 3 or 4 classes of these very shy, very dour people sort of bursting to go and, jumping, and it's lovely.
And is it happening under the Darpana banner?
Yes, it's very much a Darpada project.
And
Yes,
it's
very
going to
much.
be and it's going to be an ongoing project that will be
It's going to be
available.
an ongoing project. We are hoping to go to at least between 5 and 10,000 children over the in the next few months. And we are hoping that others will take on our offline material, which we will distribute for free and take it on further. There are families joining the kids, which is lovely. Sort of burly fathers also trying to dance and succeeding.
Okay. And are there any other projects you're working on that we can?
Our Bharatanatyam has gone online very successfully for the entire year. We haven't missed a single class, including in the lockdown. We have the technical possibility of creating very interesting material, and at that place I'm going to ask Vasant to show you added for the whole issue of climate change. We created a 3-minute piece which is called Arid, which was then taken up by the United Nations Environment Programme and by the Earth Charter, and all of these people, they have shown it, they have taken it around. It was based on a poem by a Jamaican British poet called John Agar. Everything else was conceived and created here. The artistic director of Darpana, Yadavan Chandran, actually conceived it, and I would like to show it to you. Vasant, can we have Arid? It's only 3 minutes. Of the meek should inherit an earth whose rainforest lungs breathe a tale of waste. Should we dance or break into gnashing of teeth at the news of our inheritance? Of the meek should inherit an earth where the grass goes nostalgic at the mere mention of green, and the sky looks out of its depth when reminded of blue. Should we dance or break into gnashing of teeth at the news of our inheritance? The children of the meek should inherit such an earth, then we ask of the future one question: should we dance or break into gnashing of teeth at the news of our inheritance?
Okay. Lastly, the overseas Indian community, the non-resident Indian community, has been accused often being indifferent to a few things in India, especially when it comes to issues of social justice or human rights violations. What do you think people can do, especially people who are concerned about this state of indifference?
You need to educate your fellow people of Indian descent there. I just want to ask all of those who still support what is happening in India today. You might still have roots in India, but if your great grandchildren continue living in Australia and one day are told, get out, go from where you come, where would they go? Are they not Australians? Well, the Muslims that we are trying to throw out didn't even come from somewhere like you have gone from India to Australia. They were born here. Their grandparents, great-grandparents, 100 generations are from this soil. So what are we doing when we support a government that says, go home? What home? This is home. Not only that, these are people who chose not to go to Pakistan, who chose to stay Indian. And yet we support laws and we support a government that is trying to bring in laws that will divide people by religion and caste. Think of your own situation. If you were turned out by the authorities of the country that you have adopted and left, what would you do? That's the only question that needs to be asked. You are a minority there. Whether you're in Australia or you're in America, you are a minority and the people can turn against you, which is what is happening in India. Why are we so shocked when a Sikh person is attacked by white supremacists, or a family is killed, or a group of Asian women in a laundry in America are targeted because they are Asian? We are shocked. And yet the constant lynching, the daily rape and murder, why does it not shock you? Why? Why is it different? It's not only not different, but it's 100 times worse and 100 times more sanctioned than anywhere else. When a judge says to a woman who has been violated, marry your rapist, what is the value of that woman's life or free will? Look at the realities and try and understand, put yourself in that position, because you are all in that position. The government could turn against you any time, any moment, and you are and will remain minorities there. And if you came to India, you would be a different kind of minority and still be hated. So think of that.
Mallika Sarabhai, you've been an extraordinarily courageous woman, outspoken person, and you've always stood up for what you believed in. And of course, you have extraordinarily talented. You've used your art for the social good, and you continue to do some great work. So more power to you. Thank you very much for talking to us.